Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Friday Ramblings. I'm your perpetual host, David, aka the Bardic one, for those of you in the game streaming community. And we are here to polish off our Batman Comics centric trilogy by discussing not another trilogy of interlinked Batman stories, but something behind the scenes that is just as important. Because, of course, you can't have Batman stories without the creative staff. And when it comes to Batman, especially the modern interpretation of Batman, there really is one man. Don't need this, just this. One man that has left a footprint on that Batman mythos that is like Bigfoot sized, and that is Dennis O'Neil. Now, part of the reason we're going to talk about Dennis O'Neil, besides the fact that he is very important to Batman, is that unfortunately on, make sure I got my date here right, folks, June 11th of this year, Dennis O'Neil did pass on. So, part of this is a little bit of a delayed, but still important, still good, in memory of video. Real quick is Dennis O'Neil was born on May 3rd of 1939. Bless you, kitty. Which means that at the time of his passing, he was 81 years old. So, pretty good age there. Pretty decent length of life. No, kitty, it's not time to play, kitty. Pet owners. And the fun of being one. So, as we said, Dennis O'Neil lived to be 81 years old, and he spent basically his entire adult life in the comic book industry. First as a writer, and later as an editor. And we will get into that in just a moment. He worked with the equally legendary Neil Adams, as well as Michael Kaluta and Dennis Cowan. Apologies if I missed the pronunciation both times over. Now, O'Neil was born to a Catholic household in St. Louis, Missouri, and became a comic book reader at a young age. O'Neil graduated from St. Louis University around the turn of the 1960s with a degree centered on English literature, creative writing, and philosophy. From there, he joined the U.S. Navy just before the blockade of Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, right now, salute to Dennis O'Neil. He did serve in the U.S. Navy. After leaving the Navy, O'Neil moved on to a job with a newspaper in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and wrote bi-weekly columns for the youth page, and during the slow summer months, he filled the space with a series on the revival of the comics industry. For those who don't know, during the 40s and 50s, the comic industry saw a dip in sales, especially the superhero genre. This would help serve as part of the division for comic book historians between what is now known as the Golden and the Silver Age of comics. But we'll certainly get into all that on another show. The important part is that these articles attracted the attention of Roy Thomas, who's another huge name in comic books. And when Roy left DC to go work for Marvel, he suggested O'Neill take the Marvel Writers Test, which involved adding dialogue to a wordless 4-page excerpt of a Fantastic Four comic. O'Neill's entry resulted in Marvel Comics' Stan Lee offering O'Neill a job. Although up to this point he had not really ever seriously considered writing for comics, simply did it as a fun thing to do to kill time one afternoon. You know, kind of just did the test. Yeah, what happens kind of attitude, which sounds kind of crazy, but honestly, folks, for writers, that's when some of your best work happens. When you're just being there in the moment. You're not thinking about and worrying about what's going to happen next. You know, what if I do bad? What if I do good? Just be in the moment, man. Great stuff happens then. Woo! Close up. So let's get to the fun part now that we're nice and zoomed in. Thanks to Marvel expanding the company's entire line of books, O'Neill was able to get some short-term gigs writing dialogue for various stories, including a short-term run of Doctor Strange stories in Strange Tales, along with the Western comic book Rawhide Kid and the humor title Millie the Model. He also scripted the final 13 pages of Daredevil number 18 over a plot by Lee when Stan Lee went to take a much-deserved vacation. Dennis O'Neill and artist Neil Adams would later work together, reviving the Professor X character in X-Men 65, setting up a collaboration effort that would follow them for many years in the future. And yes, we do mean revive in the most literal sense, as early in the X-Men's history, Professor X was apparently killed. This being one of the first retcons of a X-Men character-related death in comics, especially one of the good guys. For those of you who are not familiar with the storyline, the basics is it was revealed after the fact that the Professor X that died was actually a shapeshifter named Morph, who had previously fought the X-Men as a villain and had behind the scenes wanted to reform and make amends. Thus, Professor X talked him into serving as a stand-in for the Professor. Professor not knowing, shortly thereafter, a situation would happen resulting in the death of Morph, posing as Professor X. Now, when the jobs for Marvel eventually petered out, O'Neill took a job with Charlton Comics under the pseudonym of Sergius O'Shaughnessy, where he received regular work for a year and a half, before, in 1968, being offered an editorial position at DC Comics, bringing a number of got my pronouns switched. Charlton Comics editor Dick Giordano, that's what happens when you're trying to run off Cliff Notes, folks, took the editorial job at DC Comics, bringing Charlton freelancers, including Dennis O'Neill, with him. See, I'm jumping my gun. I'm trying to get to the big part that links us together with previous Batman videos, and I'm getting my people mixed up. It's okay. We got it here, folks. Appreciate you sticking with us while we corrected that. So yes, Dick Giordano, as editor, brought Dennis O'Neill to DC Comics, and here's where we make history. O'Neill's first assignments involved two strategies for bolstering DC sales. One approach centered on the creation of new characters, and O'Neill scripted several issues of Beware the Creeper, a series starring a new hero, the Creeper, created by artist Steve Ditko. From there, DC had moved O'Neill to Wonder Woman and Justice League of America, creating one of the most controversial Wonder Woman runs where he took away Wonder Woman's powers, exiled her from the Amazon community, and set her off, no costume, no secret identity, serving as basically a adventuring spy type, taking a lot of inspiration from things like the British Avengers series. In retrospect, Dennis O'Neill agrees that this was not the best decision to make, because while it did attract a lot of attention to the Wonder Woman book due to such a drastic change in the status quo, in the long term it was not necessarily the best way to redefine the character. Now, however, in Justice League he did manage to be much more appealing with his work, introducing in that title the first socially and politically themed stories, which is something he would become greatly known for later on. Specifically with two dashing young heroes who enjoyed the color green. I'm talking about Green Arrow and Green Lantern, as after a stint of time in which neither hero's book was doing great on their own, the two were merged into The Brave and the Bold as a team-up title. However, leading up to this, as part of the fun and games of making this team-up work, Bob Haney and Neil Adams had redefined Green Arrow visually and set up the idea that he was more than just a simple Robin Hood knockoff. Dennis O'Neill would take this one step further, stripping him of his wealth and playboy status, making him an urban street hero, which of course led to the Green Lantern Green Arrow team-up era, where Green Arrow would play a socially conscious left-wing style character with Green Lantern Hal Jordan serving as a foil and strawman and sounding out the political concepts that would make that run infamous and iconic, including the two-part story arc where it was revealed Green Arrow's sidekick Speedy, one of the founding Teen Titans, was addicted to heroin. This being a part of character continuity that would follow Speedy, aka Arsenal, aka Roy Harper, eventually Red Arrow, as he graduated into a hero in his own right, for the rest of his character history, at least up until all that New 52 reboot stuff. But I personally don't like to talk about that. But yes, with that two-part story and the massive critical acclaim it got for taking a very serious look at heroin addiction among teenagers that resonated greatly with stuff going on in reality, but more importantly showcasing it as, no matter how socially conscious Green Arrow tried to be, the simple fact is, like a lot of people who have the best of intentions for society at large, he did not see the forest for the trees, did not notice the problems he had in small detail close to home. Specifically that while he was traveling around the country with Hal, his protege Roy was suffering. After this storyline, Dennis O'Neill's career was pretty much set in stone because, I mean, this was a story that people outside the comic books industry embraced. For For records, the story arc is called Snowbirds Don't Fly and has been reprinted in various collections over the years, so it is easy to track down a copy. Dennis O'Neil would later recount that the massive jump from relative obscurity within the comics industry to his name being featured in major journalistic sources like the New York Times led to him entering a psychologically bad period, causing problems with his various social relationships, including his marriage. This is a sobering lesson for people that instant fame often goes to the head of even the most intelligent, well-meaning people. Especially when that instant fame is in a career like comic book writing, where you are constantly being expected to produce the next story. Still, we'll leave the further details of that to the biographers and the full-blown biographies of this man. Of course, as usual, we are here to just give a quick general picture sense to hopefully entice you to do more knowledge, research, and rambling on your own time. So with that in mind, we're going to skip to the 70s, where Dennis O'Neil would, under the direction of editor Julius Schwartz, move on to the Batman titles, which is what he is most famous for. Specifically, with the 1960s Adam West Batman TV series having concluded, and thus its influence on the comics waning, it was time to get Batman back to his roots as a Dark Knight and not so much a fun camp guy running around in tights. Noted comic historian Les Daniels said it best, quoting that O'Neil's interpretation of Batman as a vengeful, obsessive-compulsive was an act of creative imagination that has influenced every subsequent version of The Dark Knight. Now, O'Neil would team up again with Neil Adams because when things are good, you do keep it going, and O'Neil and Adams were great partners together. They created both Ra's al Ghul and O'Neil, working with Bob Brown, created Ray's daughter Talia al Ghul. They have both become iconic members of Batman's Rogues Gallery and have been most recently featured in the Christopher Nolan Dark Knight trilogy. Now, O'Neil would also bring Two-Face back into the fold, as well as revitalizing the Joker in an iconic story known as the Joker's Five-Way Revenge, bringing the character back to his roots as a homicidal maniac who murders people on a whim and delights in the mayhem and chaos caused by his actions, as opposed to how he had been written in the 60s as, well, a clown. You know? This would help cement Joker as the main villain of Batman's Rogues Gallery and his most iconic antagonist. O'Neil and Giordano would also create the Batman supporting character Leslie Tompkins. In the story, There Is No Hope in Crime Alley. For those of you who do not know, Leslie Tompkins is a doctor who is a generation above Bruce Wayne and was retroactively introduced as somebody who had known Bruce most of his life and thus became an important supporting character for both Bruce Wayne and Batman, although she would occasionally find herself at odds with the various crime fighters in Gotham, and the fact that, as a medical doctor, she felt herself philosophically and morally opposed to them living a lifestyle where it was guaranteed they were going to suffer physical harm on a nightly basis, especially involving the various teenage sidekicks that would show up, both in Gotham and in the superhero community in general. Regardless, she has been an important member of the civilian supporting cast of Batman for decades, so more power to O'Neil. Finally, O'Neil and artist Don Newton killed the original version of Batwoman in 1979 due to encouragement from editorial to help streamline the Batman supporting cast, as, well, frankly, after a while, people just really weren't that interested in Batwoman and didn't see her as essential. So, off she went. Julius Schwartz became the editor of Superman in 1971. He had O'Neil and artist Kurt Swan streamline the Superman mythos, starting with the elimination of Kryptonite. However, in 1973, O'Neil would also write the revival of two characters which DC had recently acquired the publishing rights. This would be Captain Marvel, aka Shazam, as well as working on 30s pulp hero The Shadow. He would also help with the revival of the Green Lantern title in 1976, with the help of artist Mike Grell, who also did a lot of great work on Green Arrow, before reuniting with Neil Adams for the oversized one-shot Superman vs. Muhammad Ali in 1978, which Neil Adams has called a personal favorite of their collaborations. So yeah, Dennis O'Neil had a big imprint on the Batman mythos as a writer. But we're not done yet. Neil returned to Marvel Comics in 1980, taking on the scripting chores for The Amazing Spider-Man, which he did for a year. O'Neil wrote 2 issues of The Amazing Spider-Man Annual, which were both drawn by Frank Miller, including the 1980 annual featuring a team-up with Doctor Strange. He and artist John Romita Jr. introduced Madam Web in The Amazing Spider-Man number 210 and Hydra Man in 212, both long-running characters. O'Neil was also the regular scripter for Iron Man from 82 to 86 and Daredevil from 83 to 85. During his run on Iron Man, O'Neil introduced Obadiah Stane, who, as we saw in the first Iron Man movie, became the Ironmonger, and was instrumental in Tony Stark's descent into alcoholism and eventual recovery, as well as the links of Jim Rhodes donning the Iron Man armor for the first time, before becoming most famous as War Machine, and the Silver Centurion armor. O'Neil's run on Daredevil bridged the gap between Frank Miller's 2 runs on the titles, and thus helped serve as an important, making sure the character stayed along that much respected and enjoyed status quo that Frank Miller had set up with his first run. And for you super trivia nuts, while working for Marvel, he helped write the original character concepts for the Transformers and is credited as the person who named Optimus Prime. Oh, hold on. Woo! Sneezy. Sorry, folks, I do that from time to time. Now I know what you're saying. Weren't the Transformers originally a Japanese concept? Well, yes, they were, but see, in Japan, the character known in America as Optimus Prime was called Convoy in Japan. So thus, O'Neil did in fact come up with the name of Optimus Prime, as well as help cementing the subtle differences in personality between the American and Japanese versions of the Transformers characters. However, O'Neill was not finished making an imprint on the Batman mythos because in 1986 he returned to DC Comics, becoming the editor of the various Batman titles and served in that capacity until 2000. Which means O'Neill was the editor during 2 episodes back, the Night Saga. See, I promised it was all connected. In 1987, O'Neill also began writing the Questions ongoing series. And between the years of 88 and 90, O'Neill would return to Green Arrow, writing the annuals alongside the main title. He would also have a major hand in the Armageddon 2001 crossover event of 1991, which ran through a self-titled 2-issue limited series, bookending the main crossover, which ran through the various DC annuals published that year. The bookend series was written by O'Neill and Archie Goodwin and drawn by Dan Jurgens. He and artist Joe Quesada would create the character of Azrael as that lead up to the Night Saga, which we had discussed, as I said, 2 episodes prior. That same year, O'Neill wrote the Batman Birth of the Demon hardcover graphic novel, which is important because that novel, which while originally written as a out-of-continuity, self-contained story, involved Batman and Talia al Ghul conceiving a son. This plot point would be picked up many years later and give us the main continuity debut of Damian Wayne, who would serve eventually as Robin, and in some alternate future stories, eventually become Batman in his own right. O'Neill also wrote the novelization of the films Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, and under the pseudonym Jim Dennis, with writer Jim Barry, O'Neill scripted a series of novels about a kung fu character named Richard Dragon, and later adapted those novels to comic book form for DC. O'Neill would also serve as Marvel editorial in 1980 during his run in Marvel, editing Daredevil during Frank Miller's runs as writer-artist, including firing writer Roger McKenzie so that artist Frank Miller could both write and pencil Daredevil, a decision which then Marvel editor-in-chief Jim Shooter says saved the series from cancellation. O'Neill would encourage Frank Miller to develop the believable fighting style for Daredevil that helped define his run on Daredevil and help make the famous Ronin miniseries so good due to the realistic fighting styles that it portrayed. O'Neill also edited such Marvel titles as Alpha Flight, Power Man and Iron Fist, G.I. Joe, Real American Hero, and Moon Knight, along with Transformers, written by Bob Budiansky. O'Neill would also serve while as Batman editor, the man making the final decision to kill the second Robin, Jason Todd. Although this would eventually be retconned a couple decades later and introduce the Jason Todd as who is a older, bitter, cynical hero that we would see in the previous video's discussion of Battle for the Cowl. See, it's a trilogy. 3 that fit together. Trilogies. On top of trilogies, on top of trilogies. A trilogy of trilogy. Shh. Trilogy! Made you look. Finally, O'Neill would spend several years in the late 1990s teaching a writing for the comics course at Manhattan School of Visual Arts, sometimes sharing this duty with fellow comic book writer and DC alumni John Ostrander. O'Neill was married to Mara Fran O'Neill until her death, and is the father of writer, director, producer Lawrence O'Neill, best known for the 1997 film Breast Men, starring David Schwimmer. As we did mention before, Dennis O'Neill did leave us on June 11, 2020, due to cardiopulmonary arrest. O'Neill's work in the comics industry has resulted in Shazam Award, multiples of them, and a Goethe Award. Goethe. Again, I'm horrible with pronouncing things I've only seen in written text. Winning it in 1971 and was a nominee for the same award in 1973. And also received an Inkpot Award in 1981 and 1985. And DC Comics named O'Neill as one of the honorees in the company's 50th anniversary publication, 50 Who Made DC Great. Thus, there you go, folks. That is your breakdown on the late Dennis O'Neill. A man who spent decades writing comic books, including serving as one of the stewards for the modern reinvention of Batman following the 60s camp era. Helping create, as writer, the Al Ghul family, and as editors, Azrael and Bane. Not to mention redefining the dark, villainous, homicidal nature of characters like Two-Face and Joker. So, with that, we're going to take a breather from Batman content for a few episodes. Several, probably, quite a little while here, because, you know, while we do love Batman, while Batman is very fascinating, we try to cover a large group of topics here at the Friday Ramblings. And don't forget to subscribe to the Roulette Productions channel in general, because this isn't the only show on here. We have the Wednesday morning Bardic Plays game streams, as well as Generation eXpletive, and my partner's tool-assisted style video game runs. All good content that gives you multiple days, most of the week, new content dropping. And we will do it consistently, folks. So, remember the rule of Roulette Productions. You can be critical, but be constructive about it, and be willing to accept. Just because somebody disagrees with you doesn't mean they have a personal problem with you. 7 days, we're not going to talk about Batman. We're going to lay Batman to rest alongside Dennis O'Neill, at least for a little while. Because good comic book characters, well, as we saw in both those trilogies in our previous videos, never stay down forever. And Dennis, your legacy will live forever too. So, rest assured, your work will not be forgotten. See you in 7.